talk about the whole notion of solidarity today. Solidarity is a frequently evoked but rarely analyzed concept that's been a fundamental component of workers' movements since the 19th century. It refers to a horizontal class-based relationship that extends beyond family, neighborhood, or nationality to other working people who may be total strangers. And it requires that these people recognize their common interests. The importance of solidarity thus arises from a need to fight the social fragmentation created by the development of capitalism through the establishment of relationships based on trust and mutuality. Since the 19th century, a variety of groups in the United States have championed solidarity in a whole number of ways, with African anti-colonial movements, with the Cuban Revolution, with Central American insurgencies during the Cold War. These initiatives frequently involved cross-class relationships based on common interests other than class, such as anti-racism or anti-imperialism. They raise questions about how diverse groups build connections and a sense of common purpose, how they deal with unequal relationships of power among people who have chosen to struggle together, and how they remain open to new adherents and project a broad appeal. The answers to these questions aren't clear. Nowadays, there are numerous theme and site-specific forms of solidarity, but no common political project connects them. Structural transformation, anti-imperialism, and revolution are often erased from the meaning of solidarity. So what does it mean, given the pressures toward fragmentation brought about by free market capitalism, or what is more commonly referred to as neoliberalism in Latin America, where I do research? Capitalism has constantly reorganized the economy through, for example, industrialization, internationalization, the flexibilization of labor, the aggravation of racial and gender inequalities, as well as episodic crises such as we're experiencing around us today. This process continually changes working people's place in society and their ties to each other. It obliges them to reconstitute social relationships and associational forms that once shielded them from the market, and it pushes them to develop new perspectives and organizations to replace old forms of struggle. Solidarity and fragmentation are thus part of the same process, one that poses a real paradox at the core of labor organizing. I want to talk about this paradox through an exploration of the rise and decline and partial rise again of a cross-border, cross-class coalition that's waged a campaign against the Coca-Cola Company since 2001. And in the interest of full disclosure, I've been involved with that campaign both in Colombia and the United States since about 2004. And I continue to support it, although many of the things that I'm going to say today are somewhat critical of it, but offered hopefully in a constructive way. The anti-Coca-Cola campaign has unfolded primarily in North America and Europe. It's focused less on the environmental issues that animated anti-Coca-Cola protests in India than on human rights violations in the corporation's Colombian bottling facilities. Activists allege that the company colluded with illegal paramilitary organizations to murder and terrorize trade unionists. And they've employed a range of interlocking tactics to force the soft drink giant to change its behavior. These include two principal tactics: a lawsuit against the Coca-Cola Company that was filed in US court, and a consumer boycott that targets Coke's branded image. Although the campaign succeeded in pushing the multinational to the bargaining table after 5 years of pressure, negotiations failed to produce an agreement. Talks collapsed in 2007, and erstwhile allies took different directions. And activists close to the case observed that, quote, defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory, unquote, when Colombian trade union leaders rejected a tentative deal. Yet because US activists and Colombian unionists didn't share the same political visions, the definition of victory was actually the subject of quite intense debate. Now, much of the scholarship on cross-border activism builds on Keck and Sekink's analysis of transnational advocacy networks of densely connected individuals and organizations that press a collective goal in multiple settings. These networks are not new, but cross-class transnational networks acquired a renewed salience after the war, when, as David Harvey has noted, the world experienced a period of revitalized capitalist accumulation, the reconstitution of elite power, and the dispossession of ordinary people intensified social fragmentation. Left-wing parties, political movements, and guerrilla insurgencies that had organized to demand the structural transformation of society either declined, demobilized, or lost credibility in many areas of the world. And NGOs staffed by middle-class professionals emerged to represent the needs of an amorphous civil society and to partially fill the void left by retreating state social service agencies. Much of the analysis of advocacy networks doesn't contextualize their emergence within the context of shifting class relationships, especially the changing composition of the working class. It assumes a level of connection and coordination among actors that really doesn't always exist. As Mark Edelman, an anthropologist, has noted, activists don't necessarily share the same political agendas, languages, and definitions of success, even when they seek to hold a corporation or government accountable for its behavior. Activists may have different degrees of knowledge about and connection to the multiple scenes where transnational campaigns play out. And although activism is presumably driven by domestic concerns in the countries that are the target of activist initiatives, this isn't always the case. External actors often become the driving force in transnational movements, and they may press their claims in isolation from or in opposition to allies on whose behalf they claim to be fighting. It's therefore important to explore changing class relationships and the shifting balance of power between the groups that make up cross-border coalitions, as well as among these same groups. It's also necessary to examine the militant traditions and organizing processes that animate transnational alliances. By so doing, I think we can better understand the shifting relationships of power within coalitions stretched across great distances, and how these relationships shape the ways that diverse activists frame the issues, develop protest tactics, and understand victory and defeat. I'm going to argue that even though Colombian unionists and some northern activists understand that corporations produce class inequality in both Colombia and the United States, anti-corporatism fails to describe the experiences of injustice and inequality experienced by an increasingly disposable Colombian working class, which includes many former Colombian Coca-Cola workers. This new working class is most evident in Colombian cities, where downsized workers, ruined peasants, and the marginalized urban poor contend with each other for diminishing returns in the informal economy. The anti-corporate inclinations of northern activists overlap to a considerable degree with the anti-capitalist sympathies of the Colombian trade unionists. Yet fighting abusive corporate practices, albeit extremely important, cannot encompass the more complicated problem of the dispossession and reconfiguration of the working class and the reemergence of the state in defense of class privilege under neoliberalism in Colombia. This is because anti-corporatism neglects the continuing importance of state protection for workers' rights locally, nationally, and internationally. Furthermore, the anti-Coke campaign, like other transnational labor campaigns, targets the branded image of a large corporation and focuses on extreme violations, the murder of trade unionists, rather than the quotidian abuses suffered by Colombian workers under neoliberalism. Moral outrage at the anti-worker violence in Colombia has motivated middle-class consumers to take action against the company, and it shaped the campaign's demands, which are framed in terms of human rights. This kind of what I'm going to call labor philanthropy on behalf of Colombian workers can't substitute for the labor solidarity that trade unionists request of Northern activists. Labor solidarity requires that activists struggle with them to advance workers' interests vis-a-vis the state and global corporations. So I think the anti-Coca-Cola campaign presents an interesting case to think about the unequal power relations that characterize transnational activism, the disjuncture between the goals of Colombian trade unionists and Northern activists, and the difficulty of coordinating the diverse objectives of transnational social movements. And I want to speak to these issues. The campaign against Coke has brought together militant Colombian trade unionists, US university students, human rights groups, US labor lawyers, and veteran labor activists. The coalition has aimed to hold the Coca-Cola Company accountable for colluding with right-wing paramilitary organizations to murder and terrorize Colombian workers, and to force the corporation to negotiate in good faith with the National Food and Beverage Workers Union, which is known by its acronym Transnational, which organizes workers in Coke's Colombian bottling plants. Transnational unionists bring to the campaign a working class culture steeped in Marxism and animated by old left beliefs about the centrality of the industrial working class in the process of social transformation. They belong to a sector of the Colombian labor movement known as clasista, which argues that militant struggle rather than patient negotiations with corporate officials is more likely to produce concessions from corporations. Yet for Transnational, even more important than extracting concessions from Coke is the broader process of struggle against corporate capitalism and the capitalist state through bonds of solidarity with other working people. The cross-border campaign against the soft drink giant emerged after the extreme political violence that racked Colombia in the 1990s. Right-wing paramilitaries financed by the profits from the illegal cocaine traffic and backed by the state security forces targeted workers as well as just about any other critic of the status quo in a brutal, dirty war that left thousands of people dead, disappeared, and displaced, and that, in fact, is still going on. Coca-Cola workers found themselves caught up in a wave of violence that resulted in the deaths of more than 2,000 Colombian workers between the mid-1980s and the end of the 20th century. And Colombia acquired the dubious distinction of being the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade unionist. The violence weakened or destroyed trade unions at a time when the enactment of free market reforms was generating opposition from broad sectors of Colombian society. The reforms undermined labor protections, made it easier for corporations to hire temporary laborers at lower pay, and generated increased unemployment. Transnational trade unionists and many other Colombian workers claimed that company managers worked together with the paramilitaries to rid workplaces of troublesome workers and the unions led by them. The 1996 paramilitary murder of Transnational local president Isidro Gill in the small town of Carepa and the displacement of the entire union directorate became the centerpiece of the campaign against the company. Because of the company's denials of culpability, its refusal to act to protect the lives of its workers, and the failure of the Colombian state to hold perpetrators accountable, Transnational leaders believed that they were unlikely to get any relief from the violence in Colombia. And moreover, at the same time, their efforts to build a broad-based union movement were failing. They were eager, therefore, to press their case in an international forum. And backed by US labor attorneys, they charged the company with human rights violations in a lawsuit that was filed in US federal court in 2001. For the union, the case against Coke provided it with a means to bring international pressure on the Coca-Cola Company, the company's Colombian bottlers, and the Colombian state by calling attention to the anti-union violence and the impunity that sustained it. The lawsuit arose at a moment when terror and impunity were creating the political conditions necessary for the neoliberal transformation of the economy. The threat of violence and job loss hung over anyone who challenged changes that were taking place in the workplace. And with the influx of temporary workers into Colombia's Coca-Cola bottling plants, the strike became an ineffective means of resistance, and Transnational's membership dropped by more than half. Organizing new workers was obviously an imperative, but the rise of part-time work, constant harassment from company supervisors, and the pervasive threat of violence made expanding union membership very difficult. So in its weakened state, Transnational could not mount a challenge to the erosion of working conditions. And all of this, in turn, hastened the implementation of free market policies, the further fragmentation of the workforce, and the decline of working conditions. Labor leaders understood that the industrial proletariat no longer played the leading role in societal transformation that they had once envisioned. Full-time workers like themselves were rapidly disappearing in the wake of subcontracting. And to build solidarity, it was therefore important to reach out to other potential allies and to build a broad-based opposition to neoliberal capitalism and the Colombian state. In Colombia, however, organizing non-union workers and building horizontal alliances with other groups demanded enormous discretion, and efforts to create a broader-based organization opened trade unionists to charges that they collaborated with leftist guerrillas and that their local unions were guerrilla fronts. These charges could and did have lethal consequences. The process of organizing in Colombia, however, developed with very little connection to the US-based anti-Coca-Cola campaign, which focused on consumers. In the United States, the lawsuit was only the first in an array of tactics deployed against Coca-Cola. US activist Ray Rogers joined forces with Transnational's lawyers and launched what's become known as the Killer Coke campaign with an English language website of the same name. Rogers used negative publicity against the company to draw public attention to the disparities between the iconic vision of Coke as the quintessential American soft drink and the allegations of murder and collusion with right-wing paramilitaries in the corporation's Colombian bottling plants. Rogers advocated cutting out Coca-Cola's markets, and he sought to convince large institutions such as universities and labor unions to sever or not renew contracts with the beverage giant. The objective was to force company officials to stop the violence against Transnational, to respect collective bargaining agreements with the union, and to push the corporation to compensate the victims and survivors of violence. The campaign's biggest support came from college and university students. Students were justifiably outraged by the human rights violations in Colombia and the sale on their campuses of beverages manufactured under dangerous working conditions. Many student groups worked closely with Rogers, as well as with the United Students Against Sweatshops, or USAS, a national student network that was influenced by reformist initiatives in the AFL-CIO and grew out of campus anti-sweatshop campaigns of the 1990s. For USAS, the Killer Coke campaign became part of a wider initiative to push campus administrators to practice ethical contracting by shunning corporations with abusive labor practices and to require the brands that produce university goods to pay a living wage and not repress democratic labor organizations. By late 2005 and 2006, campus-based anti-Coca-Cola protests were popping up across the United States. And for most of the students who became involved with it, I mean, certainly most of the students that I have known, the campaign expressed their general desire for social justice, understood as an end to anti-union violence in Colombia. The campus organizing also relied on the work of a handful of first and second generation Colombian immigrants. some of whom were exiles from the violence in Colombia. This immigrant left, in addition to organizing in their own communities around labor and immigration issues, addressed campus audiences about the violence against Colombian Coca-Cola workers. They recounted their harrowing personal experiences in Coke's bottling plants, and they provided an important connection between the US-based campaign against the soft drink giant and Sinal Trainal's struggles in Colombia. Yet the ability of this small group to develop a US-based campaign synchronized with the overall strategies of Sinal Trainal remained embryonic. Between 2003 and 2007, the campaign gained traction on campuses. Although its focus was Coke's labor practices in Colombia, the campaign itself unfolded almost completely in Europe and North America. Activists understood themselves to be acting in solidarity with Sinal Trainal, but they played a key role in defining the anti-corporate nature of the protest movement and in focusing the campaign on consumption. Their initiative raised questions not only about the balance of power within the alliance and the way the issues were framed, but more importantly about the importance of rank-and-file organizing in a labor protest. The lawsuit framed acts of terror and anti-union violence as human rights abuses. That's to say, violations of individual civil and political rights, rather than as a political tactic to destroy unions, to dispossess workers, and to redistribute wealth to global corporations. It reflected how, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the fall of authoritarian governments and the collapse of socialist projects, political struggle increasingly played out on the terrain of rights and moved into the legal realm. Although the case offered potential benefits to individual plaintiffs and threatened to deal a blow to Coke's branded image, it didn't examine why being a trade unionist in Colombia had become such a dangerous occupation. Lawyers did not contextualize human rights crimes within the long history of conflict between workers and the company, or the intensification of anti-union violence after the Colombian government enacted neoliberal reforms in the 1990s because of a justifiable fear of diluting the power of the lawsuit. Moreover, by treating workers as individuals, the lawsuit precluded any collective expression of grievances, and it empowered lawyers to make important decisions about the campaign. Sinal Trainal, however, appreciated the limits of legal activism, and union leaders understood the lawsuit less as an end in itself than as one tactic in a broader struggle against Coca-Cola and the neoliberal policies of the Colombian state. For the union, the lawsuit represented a desperate attempt to build international solidarity at a moment when right-wing violence was decimating popular organizations. When Rogers joined forces with the movement, he assumed the task of keeping the human rights abuses in the public eye and broadening the campaign's base of support. Through the website, speaking engagements, and media contacts, as well as protests in various places, Rogers built public pressure against the Coca-Cola Company, and he was joined by a growing number of students across the country. Together, activists used exemplary cases, especially the death of Isidro Gill, to demonstrate to consumers how a company intimately related to the American way of life terrorized and abused its Colombian workers. In this way, they appealed to consumers' sense of moral outrage and urged them not to consume Coca-Cola products. The tactic worked well on university campuses, where students understood their efforts to remove Coke as an act of solidarity with Sinal Trainal. Yet a number of issues arose that the campaign never fully addressed. Rogers became the public face of the movement in the United States, even though he never visited Colombia and had only intermittent contact through an interpreter with exiles and Colombian labor leaders when they came to the United States. Not surprisingly, there was little direct contact or coordination between Rogers and Colombian labor leaders, who never fully grasped the outsized role that he played in the campaign. Second, the focus on consumption privileged the behavior of US consumers and the locus of activism in the United States, while downplaying workers' ongoing battles against the erosion of living and working conditions in Colombia. Few US activists addressed capitalism directly, even when they were critical of it, and they accepted it more or less as the only game in town. Third, with few exceptions, most US-based activists had little understanding of Colombia, beyond media portrayals of the country as a land of drug trafficking and criminality, and reports from international human rights organizations that documented widespread violence, but offered little explanation for why it was happening. Activists were outraged by the violence, but they often lacked the analytic tools to think about its causes. Although USAS's ties to the reformist wing of the US labor movement put more students in touch with labor issues at the point of production, campus activists had only a limited repertoire of experiences and concepts with which to understand Colombian labor problems and the violence that surrounded them, and this was not their fault. Most didn't come from working class families with a history of union participation or labor militancy. They had come of age in a period of campus identity politics, the decline of trade unions, and the rise of free market fundamentalism in the United States. Few were convinced they could get social justice through the methods and goals of a labor movement that many considered obsolete. And the resurgence of a militaristic right-wing agenda within the United States after the 9/11 attacks further constrained the limits of the possible. Many immigrant exiles and Colombian labor leaders associated with the campaign envisioned a much broader struggle against capitalism, in which anti-corporatism and consumer boycotts were but one part. Yet given the circumstances in the United States and Colombia, they felt that anti-corporatism was the best way to support the Colombian Coca-Cola workers at a particularly dire moment. Although they understood that formulating their arguments in the language of the anti-capital left would have seriously limited their organizing efforts in the United States, articulating an anti-capitalist argument never occurred to the majority of US-based activists. Transnational leaders and immigrant activists understood how to mobilize US audiences. They stoked the flames of moral indignation in the US with moving testimonies about assassination attempts, death threats, kidnappings, and torture that they and their family members had experienced. But their presentations contained little of the incisive analysis that workers had developed to explain the dramatic transformations taking place in Colombia, and they were too often limited to the recounting of horrific personal events that remained decontextualized from the political and economic transformations that were going on in Colombia. For Transnational leaders, however, human rights discourse was considerably more nuanced and complicated than the simple demand for individual and political freedoms. Colombian human rights activism emerged from communist-influenced organizations and progressive sectors of the Catholic Church. Labor leaders well understood the connections between political violence and neoliberalism, and not surprisingly, the human rights frame blended easily with their own understanding of class-based politics. Several Coca-Cola workers participated in local human rights groups, and they saw no conflict between this work and their involvement with a militant trade union. For these workers, human rights discourse had become what Bill Roseberry refers to as the language of contention. That is, part of a meaningful framework for living through, talking about, and acting upon social orders characterized by domination. In the United States, however, the concept of human rights had not absorbed the left critique to the same extent as Colombia. The human rights frame privileged individual civil and political rights violations, and it downplayed Transnational's quotidian battles against the erosion of living and working conditions in both the bottling plants and in working class neighborhoods. There was no conceptual or political link between the goal of policymakers in Washington and Bogota to enact a neoliberal agenda in Colombia and the ways that political violence perpetrated by right-wing mercenaries tied to the state, local elites, and global corporations was prying apart social relationships and incorporating vulnerable working people into new relationships of inequality. None of this surprised Transnational leaders, but they discovered that if they spoke about human rights with a US accent, they could bring US citizens on board to support their cause. Sinal Trainal's opposition to worsening labor conditions in Colombia, especially subcontracting, had made union leaders the targets of paramilitary violence in the first place. But this resistance became blurred within the US human rights frame, which voided references to capitalists and the working class, or to the rich and the poor, and simply asserted that Colombian trade unionists had the right to free association without the threat of constant terror. In the absence of an analysis that linked political violence to neoliberalism, it was difficult to understand the human rights crimes against Sinal Trainal leaders as more than just the immoral practices of a shameless corporation and the bloodthirsty mercenaries linked to it. The conflicted history of company-union relations, the opposition to neoliberalism, and the growth of a disposable workforce in Colombia were either downplayed or eliminated from view. Sinal Trainal leaders and US-based exiles became little more than valiant victims for their US audiences. This, however, was not the case in Colombia, where union representatives were viewed through various lenses and pulled in multiple directions. Some rank-and-file Coca-Cola workers in Colombia were skeptical about Sinal Trainal's confrontational style and worried that it would produce little more than the deaths of more workers like themselves. They also harbored suspicions that rumors about union leaders' alleged ties to left-wing guerrillas might be true. A segment of Sinal Trainal's members also took a dim view of the international campaign because they were concerned with immediate bread and butter issues. Some even suspected union representatives of using international travel to pursue a fancy lifestyle beyond Colombia in the United States. And this proposition was frequently voiced by Coca-Cola management to discredit the Sinal Trainal leadership to the rank and file. And finally, Sinal Trainal's leaders had to constantly address criticism from other sectors of the Colombian labor movement that questioned the international campaign's exclusive focus on Coca-Cola, when paramilitaries and state security forces were terrorizing literally thousands of other people, including workers. Toward the middle of 2006, the campaign reached a crucial juncture when Sinal Trainal's US lawyers decided to reassess it and then sought a negotiated settlement with the corporation. The decision-making process took place almost entirely among US activists, and it demonstrated the power exercised by attorneys in campaigns involving legal activism. Union leaders, however, were suspicious of a settlement. In the absence of an outright victory that held Coca-Cola publicly accountable for the murder of trade unionists, the possibility of a settlement opened up a gray area of confidential talks with company representatives whom Sinal Trainal leaders deeply mistrusted. Trade unionists had learned from experience that the corporation did not always respect agreements with the union. Some also suspected that the company would attempt to buy them off without acceding to any of their demands, such as an end to subcontracting and the reinstatement of fired workers. Moreover, at least a few influential Sinal Trainal leaders never wanted to see the case resolved at all, as the lawsuit provided a convenient club to bludgeon Coca-Cola. Despite these reservations, the unionists accepted the advice of counsel, and they agreed to seek a settlement. But not surprisingly, the different goals and perspectives that had always informed the anti-Coca-Cola coalition came into more overt conflict in the ensuing talks. Beginning in 2006, Sinal Trainal's lawyers and union representatives met with company officials in a series of meetings to negotiate a settlement. Tensions between the company negotiators and union leaders were high, but this was nothing new. A more disturbing problem developed as the relationship between the union, its lawyers, and Rogers became strained. Labor leaders felt that their lawyers failed to understand the situation faced by workers in Colombia, and that they were not advancing key issues that Sinal Trainal considered important, such as subcontracting. The lawyers, for their part, became ever more confused about what the union wanted, or if it even wished to settle, and they felt that the union was not speaking with one voice. And although Rogers did not participate in the negotiations, both the union and the lawyers viewed him as a loose cannon. Despite the tensions, the lawyers managed to cobble together a deal that they believed got the union most of what it wanted. Although the outline of the proposed agreement was never publicly disclosed, the settlement reportedly included financial compensation for victimized families in the union, and the lawyers urged Colombian labor leaders to accept it. Trade unionists, however, did not see the deal as either a victory or a solution to the union's problems, which had continued to worsen. As the talks had dragged on, Coca-Cola had continued to fire Colombian workers who affiliated with Transnational, arguing in the case of temporary workers that they had no right to unionize because they worked for a subcontractor and not the Coca-Cola Company. Transnational representatives on the negotiating team also received constant death threats. The union saw the hand of Coca-Cola behind the death threats, but workers were precluded from speaking out because the corporation they couldn't speak out against the corporation during the negotiations because of a binding arbitration agreement that included a non-disparagement clause. Yet it was the possibility to denounce the violence and hold the corporation accountable in the court of public opinion that had drawn the union into the lawsuit in the first place. Indeed, some union leaders believed that they were still alive because of the pressure that international condemnation had placed on the company. Transnational's leaders concluded that the settlement failed to offer a solution to the continuing violence, the ongoing erosion of working conditions, and the weakening of Transnational. In their opinion, the settlement amounted to little more than a corporate effort to buy off the union. It also created other problems. Transnational leaders claimed that the settlement limited their ability to mount future protests against the company, and they worried that the union, as well as victimized workers and their families who received financial compensation, would become targets of extortion demands by a range of armed groups. Because of these worries and considerations, union members decided to reject the proposed agreement and cut off settlement talks with the company. In the aftermath of the failed settlement negotiations, the groups that formed the Anti-Coca-Cola Alliance moved in different directions. Transnational sought new ways to build on their international contacts and restart the campaign, overestimating perhaps the availability of resources from northern institutions that no longer perceived a campaign with a clearly defined endpoint or a union that would compromise with Coca-Cola. Meanwhile, Rogers was unaware of Transnational's initiative to restart the campaign, as he had never stopped campaigning in the first place. Transnational's lawyers, for their part, looked for other cases in Colombia to prosecute, having grown frustrated with Transnational. So to kind of conclude now, the campaign against Coca-Cola demonstrates the disjunctures that shape cross-class, cross-border alliances. It underscores the difficulty of synchronizing diverse activists, and it elucidates the limits of what was possible in 21st century Colombia and the United States. In Colombia, the anti-Coca-Cola campaign offered Transnational leaders one of their few remaining options. The paramilitary assault against trade unionists had gained its maximum intensity, and the anti-worker violence was bolstering the aim of the Colombian government to restructure the labor force in accord with neoliberal principles. The campaign constituted a last-ditch effort to draw international attention to their plight and to find new allies who could operate without the constraints imposed on workers in Colombia. On many US campuses, it raised awareness of anti-worker violence in Colombia and pushed several university administrations to cut or reevaluate their ties to the Coca-Cola Company, which was briefly placed on the defensive. Yet building transnational alliances bumped up against several problems. The campaign was for all intents and purposes led by northern middle-class activists, even though it focused on anti-union violence in Colombia. And these activists were neither fully engaged with the labor struggles taking place in Colombia, nor with the immigrant activists who offered a link to Transnational and a broader vision of social change. Many rank-and-file student activists did not grasp the connections between the political violence against trade unionists and the labor battles waged by Transnational. the frequency and depth of the contacts between middle-class anti-Coca-Cola campaigners in the United States and Colombian trade unionists also varied considerably, and in some cases there was little or no contact. And even when there was contact, Colombian labor leaders chose to emphasize a US-accented conceptualization of human rights, which they knew could mobilize supporters, but which did not do enough to educate US audiences about the consequences of free market policies in Colombia and the role of the US and Colombian governments in enacting them. Well-organized consumer boycotts have considerable potential insofar as they involve worker and community organizations and pressure governments and corporations to change abusive labor policies. Yet if a goal of transnational activism is solidarity with working people and not labor philanthropy, activists must seek ways to better coordinate the diverse goals of groups in the North and the South, and to broaden alliances to include immigrants, trade unionists, and people of color. Northern activists might also attend more closely to the analyses, tactics, and sensibilities of working people in Colombia. The histories, organizing traditions, and political agendas of domestic activists in the countries targeted by transnational campaigns offer very important lessons to Northern allies, and finding ways to support and broaden these struggles with all of their imperfections and contradictions is a high priority. So I'll stop there, and if people have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks. The question was basically how, to speak more to the issue of how human rights is understood in the United States. Right? Okay. Well, I think since human rights has been with us for a long time, but since the end of the Cold War, it's really emerged as a much more sort of global discourse. And in the aftermath of 9/11, it became a justification, for example, for the invasion of Iraq, that the United States was the last surviving superpower, and only it alone could bring democracy and justice to the benighted peoples of the Third World. So it has had that very nasty edge to it in this country. Also, I think it's very common in the United States to think about human rights as something that we, quote unquote, Americans give to others, and not as an issue that US citizens face in this country, which is, I think, discussed more in terms of civil rights. But I think one could certainly argue that human rights should be an issue for US citizens as well. What I was trying to really focus on in the talk, though, was the way in which human rights in the campaign is really more articulated around political rights, voting, the freedom of association, and so forth, and not really addressing enough economic rights. The right to a living wage, the right to decent housing, and so forth. And as a result, there was, I think, a real disconnect between the ways that US citizens in this country were thinking about it and the ways that human rights was understood by Colombian trade unionists, who had really the notion is very much debated in Colombia as well. I mean, there was a time when, people thought that it was this kind of bourgeois distraction. But then as the violence intensified in Colombia, and a lot of the trade unionists, for example, at Coca-Cola, became involved in local human rights committees, the distinctions, it really became sort of fused much more with the sort of class-based politics of the union, and much more than just the right to go out and vote or right, exactly, yeah.
You mentioned some of the ways theoretically that students can adjust their activism on this issue to be more in line with the tactics and ideas of Colombian workers. But if Killer Coke, this organization that's emerged, Killer Coke, is very implicated in that redefinition away from their original goals in Colombia, that's really the only sort of national or international infrastructure that I can think of in place for even making attempts at that connection. So are there other ways you can make that connection? And my second question would just be if you could speak on, do you think that the current economic crisis has created any openings for the kind of cross-nation solidarity that might actually be genuine in challenging capitalism?
Yeah, the second question is very difficult to answer. I hope so. I really don't know at this point. With respect to the first question, yeah, I mean, I guess, I'm not really trying to dump on the Killer Coke campaign because, I mean, in many ways, I very much support it. But one of my critiques, I think, is the sense that it's been a bit out of step with what Colombian workers, are thinking and doing. So I think the question is, how do we think about synchronizing those activities a little more? It's very difficult. I mean, I think students can read more about Colombia. I think there are ways that one can visit Colombia. Witness for Peace, for example, runs several delegations every year to Colombia. So does US LEAP, the US Labor Education Project. So there are lots of ways that one can visit Colombia and be safe and talk to trade unionists and get a sense, get a better sense of what's going on. I think just I was talking about this actually the other day with a colleague. I think some of the responsibility, professors like me share as well. That in our courses, I think it's it's important that we teach students about the history of the United States, the role of labor in this country. That we think about inequality more than the sort of emphasis on floating signifiers and so forth that has been, so in vogue, among postmodernists. Everybody has a responsibility. I don't think it's just students.
You mentioned at one point, I think when you were talking about the union in Colombia as having a sort of old left ideology. Mm-hmm. Would it be fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you see sort of campus activism sort of aligned with the anti-Coke campaign as coming from a more sort of, I guess, new left tradition, say from the 60s and 70s, that sort of had a different sort of historical, it sort of gave up on sort of class politics, essentially, right, in the 60s and 70s, and how it sort of viewed the working class in sort of different ways. It's not a sort of revolutionary class. And then, again, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to be like, in terms of making this linkage, you talk about this delinkage between these groups, would a more sort of sustained critique of neoliberalism, a more sort of structural critique, be sort of what the way forward, do you think? A sort of an old new left, or a new old left, I don't know how you would call it, in terms of what students can do.
Yeah, well, I don't think that I don't see the campaign coming so much out of the new left. I mean, that's kind of probably my generation and not yours. I mean, I think a lot of the people that have been involved in the campaign really were born in the 1980s under Reagan. So, it's quite different. But yeah, I think that thinking about the ways in which human rights and neoliberalism are connected is really important, and not just seeing human rights as something that goes on when paramilitaries threaten workers in Colombia, but that that paramilitary violence has been intimately tied to the enactment of neoliberal policies like subcontracting, privatization, downsizing, and so forth in Colombian plants. So the two are really intimately connected, and I think understanding that relationship is really important.
In terms of the problems with decision-making and power relations between the US-based folks and the Colombians, there's a model that I've been involved in with El Salvador that I think could be useful in some ways, but I don't necessarily see it solving a lot of the other problems. First of all, the Salvadoran solidarity relationship with sister cities in an organization called Cryptus involves staff people who are either Salvadorans and or North Americans who work out of the same office, that are part of a collective decision-making structure with a very long-term relationship. Which to me, it's hard enough to build trust, even in our experience, that if it's sort of thought of as a campaign, because it's necessarily temporary. But I think that sort of model works out fairly well, and I think Witness for Peace probably does things like that. They have fairly permanent relationships. But the problems that this does not resolve, first of all, in El Salvador's case, gone are the very extreme examples, for the most part, of human rights abuses of the kind that are featured here and the kind that the Colombians understand perfectly as being motivators for people here. And interest in El Salvador evaporates. If the happy occurrence ever comes about that Colombia becomes just another place where neoliberal exploitation takes place without extreme violence, I dare say a lot of that interest may disappear also if the interest was generated by this extreme frame. So I think you're absolutely right. You need to have this human rights neoliberalism shift, but absent a powerful and coherent movement in the United States with the kind of analysis that you would need for that, and also organization and so forth, communications alone isn't going to solve it. But I think that that would be a necessary first step that you could actually take, is say, all right, if we're really doing labor-student solidarity, let's build lasting relationships, a structural and institutional communication system, and then at the very least you can have conversations about these things rather than having, you know, Ray Rogers, who's quite a star in his own right, sort of off doing his thing, and so on. So I guess a reaction to that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think one of the differences between Central America and Colombia is that the involvement of immigrants in, well, certainly in the Central American anti-war movement during the 80s was huge. I mean, C-Space and NCMEC and all kinds of organizations were really Central American organizations that you know, were being led and directed by Central Americans. That's less the case with the Coke campaign, where I think the ability of Colombian immigrants to really make it theirs has been more problematic.
Though, in one respect, they're comparable, because in each case, beyond the expats from El Salvador, the larger target audience was largely white and middle class.
Yeah, right.
But that was a key difference that made it easier to, I mean, it was a strategy of the Salvadoran movement precisely to have this as a long-term part of what they were doing. And I don't know what the thought is. Is this a campaign that ends? Or is this an ongoing relationship that moves beyond a campaign to something else?
Yeah, I don't think that's clear.
I was thinking, framing the problem of human rights violations in a kind of Marxist framework. Wouldn't that be detrimental to this whole campaign, given the rejection that there is among the Colombian population of these left movements?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's why it didn't happen, because people understand that you know, trying to wage an anti-corporate campaign in the United States using Marxism, using the concepts of Marx, is not going to get you anywhere. So yeah, so that, exactly. So it would have been a non-starter.
Were you saying in Colombia it would have been rejected as well?
Also, yeah, both here and
yeah, well, in Colombia, yes, certainly in some sectors it would have been rejected, but more than anything, it was just politically impossible, because it would have just made people more targeted than they already were.
I want to come back to this question about why it is so taken for granted that anti-capitalist discourse in the United States never will work. Right. I think what is lacking maybe is a little bit also in the investigation why that should be so. I don't think we can just say, okay, it's not going to work, so let's look for something else. Mm-hmm. The reasons are perfectly exactly there. And then to say, okay, we can't use that language because it doesn't work here is the wrong approach. The approach should be to analyze why political economy, critique of political economy is impossible in this country, and who is behind that. It's not like, you know, discourses are just floating around and there is no power differences, and who is producing these discourses that make any critique on that particular level impossible.
Yeah, well, I mean, it hasn't always been impossible. I mean, we did have a period in the United States when there was an upsurge in labor organizing, and while people were not necessarily, you know, using, you know, it wasn't always being articulated in Marxist terms. You know, the 1930s was a very different period than the one that we live in today. And I think, you know, I think for students, making the connections between the present in the United States and the past, and that we have had, you know, periods when labor was much more important than it is today, when, you know, more 20–30% of workers were actually unionized. And you know, understanding the history of labor in this country, and you know, not just seeing labor unions as these, you know, outdated relics that are, you know, run by white men who are overweight and drive Cadillacs. You know, which is sort of how I grew up seeing labor unions in the Midwest. You know, so I think, you know, understanding the history of labor in our own country, broadly defined, you know, is really important, and that might be one way to, you know, to start addressing your concern.
I just wanted to add also, I mean, there are indigenous labor traditions, farmer labor alliances from the 19th century and so forth that even predate Marxist language. So it's not like Marxist language is the only language that you can use to critique class, rich and poor, and so on. Right. Maybe some of the difficulty comes when you use language that doesn't resonate culturally, but you can say the same damn things. That's right. And you don't have to get all, you know, pussyfooting around. Right. It's just a question of framing things in ways people react properly to in terms of their own experiences.
Yeah, that's right. So you have to, you know, pick language that's appropriate for the time that you're living.
Is there any relationship, or what are the reactions among the Colombian workers that you've been studying or, you know, been working with, and the Bolivarian governments, Venezuela, Bolivia, I guess now Ecuador? You know, what's the opinion on that path? And is there any connection between the governments in those countries and the labor struggles in Colombia? I think
among the unionists that I know in Colombia, there's been a lot of enthusiasm with the rise of Chavez in Venezuela. And actually, the last time I was in Colombia, I was talking to one guy who had actually just come back to Venezuela, where he'd been meeting with a bunch of different people in the labor movement. And he was very frustrated because you know, he felt that while in Colombia it was impossible to do anything because of Uribe, in Venezuela there were a lot of possibilities because of Chavez, but that the labor movement wasn't taking advantage of them.